just thinking about the use of our time, I really had not anticipated that we would have gone as long as we did, but I'm glad that we did, and I think it was helpful and beneficial. And many of you have commented, this is why I came to seminary, to learn how to put it together to preach. And this really is bottom line. It's pulling everything forward to the bottom line and implementing 4 years of education. I went to seminary so that somebody would teach me how to stand up with a Bible and to be able to say, "Thus says the Lord." And where I could do it without having to listen to someone else's tape and write it down and then rewrite it and preach someone else's sermon. Someone teach me how to preach my own sermons. Well, that involves, number one, you've got to know the content to know what to say. And I didn't. So I needed, the 4 years, in fact 5 years to get a THM. Someone teach me the Bible so I can know what to say, but also not just what to say, but how do I pull it together and then deliver it. It's not enough to have it in the warehouse. It's got to be in distribution. It's got to be marketed and taken out to where people are. So I hope that God will use this class to help you to get it out of the warehouse, everything that's being stockpiled into your mind of truth about the Bible, that this can have some help in how do I get it into the trucks and send the trucks out on the streets to take it to where the stores are, where people are, to distribute this truth, to pass on this knowledge that I'm accumulating. Now, if all you do is just accumulate knowledge and there's no distribution, there's no of it flowing through to other people, you will be a swamp. There's a river flowing in, but it doesn't flow anywhere. It doesn't go to anyone else. If all you do is take in truth for 4 years, you will become a stagnant swamp spiritually. And there are things that grow in a swamp. There's bacteria, there's insects, there's mosquitoes. You don't even want to go into a swamp. If there's nothing coming into you, then you're just a dry creek bed. What you want is it's flowing into you and it's flowing out of you. And that is a mighty current and a river. And that's what you want. You want it coming into your life. You want it coming out of your life. So I would encourage you while you're in seminary, to the extent that your schedule allows it, to have a ministry and for the Word of God to be coming into you, but also going out of you into somebody's life. And when I was in seminary, I didn't have a ministry or anything, and I just went to 3 men, and then I went to 5 men, and just, can I have a Bible study with you? And I've already mentioned it, but can I teach you the book of James and just sit down and go through it? And whether there were 50,000 people sitting there or 5 people sitting there, I went through the same preparation, and it was flowing out of me. So I would urge you to the extent that you can. And I realize some of you guys are under enormous pressures financially and with kids and wife and the whole thing. But somehow, some way under heaven have a ministry such that your ministry won't start after graduation, that your ministry will start now. When I was in seminary, I can't remember if I mentioned this or not, I went and bought a little traveling lectern, little podium. I drove a Volkswagen Bug, one of those tiny little bugs. I had no air conditioning, and it was just no electric windows. You had to, crank it down, but I kept it in the back seat, and I could just show up anywhere and set up my little podium, pull the peg out, and disassemble it and put it back together. And I'm ready to preach, teach wherever I can go, wherever I can be. And would set that up in homes and people's living rooms and just various places. And I say all this to say, for your education to really have maximum impact, it doesn't really have maximum impact until you're having to do something with what you're learning. And so I would just encourage you, even if it's whatever small thing that might be. And I understand the limitations. And I went through as a single guy, and there actually are a lot of advantages being a single guy. You don't have the weight of responsibility of providing for a family. But somehow, some way for this to be coming out of you. And one of the brothers who came up and just said, as you were doing the 2 Timothy, kindle afresh, that was for me, because the seminary has become a cemetery. And I think we all understand what that can be like. And I say that because I think we all can relate to that at times. Well, part of kindling afresh the gift of God is using the gift of God. And when you use it, you keep it glowing. And when it's stagnant, you become stagnant. Let's take just a moment to talk about this. What strikes you? What hits you? What connects? What puzzles? What would you ask? Yes, sir.
One thing we've learned in our hermeneutics classes is when you see a parable to look for one main point.
Yeah.
When we look at this and we see 10 truths about health, how do we pull out 10 truths that like you did, that are accurate, and not look into parables and make it like 20 things about heaven that aren't really
I totally believe that there is one main point to a parable. I think that is a sound interpretive hermeneutical principle. But I think the longer parable has some parts to it. If it's a 2-sentence parable, it's more easy to reduce it to, there's really nothing else going on in here for us to learn. But I think with the longer parable, there's Jesus intentionally gave us various details that, if they square with the rest of Scripture, I think are legitimate. I think each of these points are true, whether they are found in this text or not. But I think that they legitimately are. Now, I totally understand that if you press a parable at too many places, you give up the high ground of certain doctrines. It's a very good question, but I don't think that has happened here. I'm also using commentaries to make sure that I'm not the first person in the history of the church to try to come up with something, because if it's new, it's not true. And so it's within the parameters of orthodoxy.
Are we seeing? We're seeing the final draft. Do you have a rough draft of your manuscript? Because you say get it on the page. I'm assuming to get it on, it's not pretty initially.
Yeah, for me, I don't do a rough draft anymore. I just do this. But there's a lot of cutting and pasting with scissors and Scotch tape, and adding things in the margin and cutting in things. I don't have any whiteout. That's too technical. But but I've got my little scissors and my little Scotch tape, and like I said, sometimes it'll be 6 layers, 5 layers high with things, Scotch taped over other things, which are Scotch taped over other things. And for me, I'm just able to pull it together more quickly.
When you do your block diagram, you kind of scratch out your notes there, scratch out your notes on your Xerox, so you've already kind of maybe written things out somewhat, so that is kind of the process by the time you get to your manuscript.
Yeah, I've written things out, and I've also gone and Xerox things, and like out of a theological encyclopedia or a dictionary, and I've already underlined those things. And so I'm just going to be pulling it out and either directly quoting it or restating it, rather than typing it into a rough draft and then transitioning to the final manuscript. I'm just kind of just going directly to it. But it's taken me, many years to get to that point. It used to be that there was a a rough draft. But I think there's a development over years through practice that we will all have.
One quick question about your pages. I don't know if this is the case with you, but do your pages indicate for you somewhat of timing? Because I used to, with manuscripts, I realized, wow, it takes about 10 minutes to get through a page, roughly. I'll know this is 4 full pages, because I used to type mine out. I had paragraphs and everything, so I knew that was about 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Does that kind of work for you, or is it just...
No, for me, it works. The introduction is going to be about 3 pages. Each heading will be about 3 pages. The conclusion will be about 2 pages. And so the way that adds up, unless there's a particular point that I then further develop, and so it's more numbers of pages rather than which page. Or it's kind of the same thing you're saying. So I just have a feel for how many pages there are per point, per heading, and how many pages per introduction and conclusion. Now, I knew this one because I was extrapolating out that, hell is a place of, hell is a place of. That was going to take time to even just say those words and draw unusual emphasis, and then I would want to reinforce or support what I was saying. So I knew that was going to take some time. There would be a few more pages, and that's why I cut short the application under the second point, and that's, I tried to tighten some things.
Dr. Lawson, I have a question about personal pronouns. I think it's a challenge because, on the one hand, if you never use we, it's kind of unhumble to not include yourself. But if you don't use that you lose the directness.
Yes.
So I even struggle with that in personal witnessing as well. So I guess the question is what factors, for example, the audience you're speaking to, that can have an effect on what personal pronouns you use?
Sure, it's a great question, and I still am trying to dial in, the hot water and the cold water and get the temperature just right on that. I think as a general rule, we start with we and move to you. We have all sinned. Does this not speak to all of our hearts here today? Who among us here today has not been in this place? And do we all have need of this grace? And then to transition, but there are some of you here who, though you know you have this need, have never responded to God's grace. So it's kind of like a funnel. You start at the widest and you narrow it down to the you. I think some of it is you read the eyes of people, and the we is kind of almost taking a step back and the you is taking a step forward, and being able to gain a hearing with people and know when it's right to step across the threshold into their house, when to stay on the front porch and when to walk in to their house. And the we is on the front porch, and the you're beginning to meddle, and you're beginning to invade their privacy a bit. But I want to get to the you, and I will eventually get to the you. Sometimes quicker, sometimes a little bit more intentional. That's a great question. And beyond that, I think we really are dependent upon the Holy Spirit. We're not consciously aware. We don't hear voices or anything, but for Him to be at work within us, to will and to work for His good pleasure, His hand in the glove of our life, controlling us and moving us. And I think it's in part the answer to our prayers before we preach, that God will direct our thinking and God will control our words, and a conscious awareness of my dependence upon the Holy Spirit. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for one of the best messages I think I've heard in my entire life. But I have a question, because the message was very heart-touching. So at a certain point you said one of every person dies, and we all laugh.
Yeah.
And do you think that could take people away from us?
Yeah, it could. It could. And actually, I didn't say it when I preached it. I said it for you guys because I know you would laugh. Gotcha. Yeah, no, to make your very point, I actually did not say it. It seemed appropriate in the study, and once I was in the pulpit in the heat of the moment, it seemed like it was inappropriate to be laughing with the subject of hell.
Do you write a positional statement?
More in my head than on paper, and just try to, on the third page of, the point of the parable is to show the great reversal that death brings to many. I mean, for me, I really narrowed that down, that was kind of the exegetical point of this, that the rich man who had everything goes to hell and has nothing, and the poor man who has nothing goes to Abraham's bosom and has everything. I mean, to me, that was the essential message of this, and that many who are rich and who think that they are right with God, in reality, have nothing. Yes, sir.
On every point that you do on your sermon, you always have to, you always put the challenge on the point.
Yeah, I try to, and there will be exceptions, and I don't want it to seem forced, but I want to make every heading personal with the listener. Now, it might be that in my preaching, I get ahead of myself and I make the application earlier, like if that heading has 3 verses, it may be when I get to the second verse, for whatever it says, I exhort with the second verse and I make application, and then I finish out the heading with the third verse. And it would only be because I've already attached this to their lives, and it would be redundant to do it again. But in the writing of my notes, I try to show the implication, to make application, to give exhortation at the end of each heading, so that it's as I go. But I don't do it I don't want it to be in a forced way. And again, many times it may be that second verse is really the thunder of that heading. And that's when the lightning strikes, is in the second verse. That's a great question.
With regards to observation, because I'm having a hard time to do that, and I was surprised that you came up with 8 with regards to the place of hell. So how do you extract that? How are you going to develop a good sense of observation?
Yeah, great question. It's usually like with a pen in my hand, and I've Xeroxed the passage, and I just begin to look. I want these to line up, and I want them to be very simple. Subheadings need to be like 1 word or 2 words. And if it's 2 words, one of those words is always the same. It was saving faith. It was singular faith. It was God-given faith. It was, whatever, something faith. And here it was something place. I don't know. I just began to, look at it and pore over it. Many years ago, when I preached this like 30 years ago when I was a younger man. And as I preached it, there were I think I had 5 things. And the more you study, and the more you look, the more you see. And I don't know, it seemed like there was a legitimate measuring out of 8 observations. Where there would be something out of each verse that could be pulled out of that was unique and distinct. Remember, or far away, or torment, or fire, or agony, or Hades. I don't know, each one of those seemed to have a unique feature to it and could be a heading unto itself. Remember, there is the art and the science of expository preaching. The science part has to be the same for everyone in this building. There are laws of interpretation. There are laws of etymology and word studies. There are laws of grammar. There are laws of syntax. There are basic laws of communication. We all must have that same science. But the art of exposition is as different as one man is to another. If we assigned this text to everyone in this class and asked you to write out a sermon and turn it in, there would be different introductions, there would be different outlines, there would be different divisions, perhaps. There would certainly be different subheadings like I had. And that is expected. That is to be. I mean, we don't, all line up like ducks and just quack the same. Each man has his own personality. Each man has his own temperament. Each man has his own IQ. Each man has his own giftedness. Each man has his own background. Each man has his own flock. Each man has his own age. Each man has, there's just endless lists. And each one of those is a factor in shaping the difference in the art of exposition. If I handed you a canvas and paint and a brush and told you to paint the mountain range there, all of our paintings would be, they couldn't be exactly the same. And there might be difference in styles. And so that is part of like the subheadings, and for others, they wouldn't even think of like going through a list like that. That's just the way my little brain works. I like hooks. I like pegs. I like links in the chain. I'm a linear thinker. It just helps me. In fact, some of it helps me as a preacher maybe more than it helps the listener, just to be able to walk through this. It organizes my thought. It helps me see what is primary. That's a good question, though. Yeah.
With all the background information that you could bring into it, is there like other principles that you kind of live by to know what to bring into the actual exposition? Are there things that you like as far as even supporting the idea that Hades is the same as hell, like to where you could give all kinds of evidence to back that up, or you could just state that?
Yeah, sure. That would depend upon the audience. If I was preaching here and had seminary students, then that would be something that I would need to give explanation to. But in my church, which is a fairly biblical literate congregation, they've sat into my preaching, some of them for 18 years, I felt no need to major on minors. And that's majoring on minors. When I was a younger man, when I first got out of seminary, I had some people in my church who would always come up after I would preach and would ask me various different questions, trying to pin me down on little minute things, and I caved into that and would show up. Let me give you 8 reasons why Hades is hell. And I finally realized I'm preaching a sermon to 2 people, not 600 people. And I'm too concerned about this man who is an Associated Press reporter who goes into murder scenes and looks for evidence. And I'm trying to carry out my preaching as though I'm catering to his Associated Press reporting. And I'm not. I need to be like Martin Luther, and I need to preach to the common man. And I would also add, Dr. MacArthur says, in my sermons, I only tell you maybe 10% of what I know about this. If I told you everything, we'd be here all day, all week. And so you have to make decisions. And so it's usually a younger theological student or someone who's about to go into the ministry who's really hung up on something like that. And at that point, I would rather just refer him to an encyclopedia article or a theological journal article than take the whole church through all 8 reasons for this. But if I was the pastor here and I had the seminary here and I had faculty and young men and I was writing a New Testament commentary series and I had a study Bible those are a lot of ifs. Then yeah, I would kind of go off, and give layers of background. But I think it's secondary, really. I mean, in some ways, it's a very secondary point. The fact is, he's in hell. Whether it's a temporary holding place, whether it's an eternal place, whether it's right next to, although it does say far away. At some point, it almost becomes how many angels can dance on the head of a needle. The fact is, you're going to hell. So, yeah.
This sermon you just gave is more towards, I guess, an adult congregation.
Yeah.
Like your own. And for those of us who are serving youth in college, what tips would you give?
I would bring it in spades to college students, and I would bring it to high school students. I wouldn't hold back. With high school students, I might need to know who those high school students are. And I don't want to, violate certain things about their lives, but you need to know about hell. I mean, you're old enough to go to hell. And you need to know that you need to be saved, and you need to know what God has saved you from if you are saved, and you need to know where you're going if you're not saved. And there's also this factor. If I was speaking to a youth group and there were 30, 40 youth group, there's a certain tone and volume. It's totally different if I'm preaching to 120 seminary students in here who can handle, kind of a push. And in fact, even kind of like a push. And I would have sensitivity to whom I'm speaking and try to be appropriate in the tone and the trajectory of what I'm saying. Having said that, I preach down in the basement here at Grace. I preach down there once a year to the high school ministry, and I certainly preach to the college ministry. And I preached a sermon to the high school ministry here at Grace Community a year and a half ago. They asked me to preach on the second coming of Christ, and the door open and the white horse descending and a sword coming out of his mouth, and my daughter was there and my sons were there, and I was stronger than dirt. I was stronger than what I was here, and I'm glad that I was. And because, all the stuff you're watching on video and all the stuff you're watching on television and cable, it's not like you're in Little House of the Prairie and, you're just, sitting at home sorting your socks. You're having every kind of, you're being bombarded with dark, heavy forces, and people, are shooting up kindergartens and on and on and on. It's a different world as far as exposure. And I think I have every right to get to you. Now, this isn't every Sunday, every time you get the youth group together. We're going back through Luke 16, okay? So buckle your pew belt. Here we come. But I think that periodically the hammer needs to be brought. So, I literally made statements on that sword. He's coming to slit throats. He's coming to drain blood. He's coming to conquer and to consume and to damn and to judge. And, I just laid it all out. And those little eyes were like, saucers, great. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Yes, sir.
There's often a great pressure to come up with the perfect illustration.
Yeah.
And it was a phenomenal sermon, and if any illustrations there weren't, maybe one small one.
Yeah.
And so really a two-part question. Have you noticed over your years of preaching that you've decreased how many illustrations you use? And then second, kind of different but related, is there a caution against using personal illustrations of your own life or family?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. First of all, there is a decreasing number of illustrations that I use, and I don't know why, but that is true. And I think I have more to say about the Bible. I think I used to be more dependent upon illustrations to be able to communicate and to convey. I think illustrations are important. They're not as important as I used to think they were or are. I generally place an illustration now at either the introduction or the conclusion, but once I'm in the text, my ears are pinned back and I'm just like in the text and moving. It could be very appropriate for there to be an illustration, though, and some of it is personal preference and style. So my own self-critique, I probably need more illustrations. So if someone came up to me and said, I think you need to start using illustrations, I would say, I in part agree with you. So that's probably a limitation of mine, and that's, again, the art part. On preaching a longer parable like this, the whole text is an illustration. In preaching narrative, it's all an illustration. Or narrative is reality, but it's a picture of reality. This is an illustration. I have found that I probably need them more as I preach epistle, as I preach Hebrew poetry, and in my Psalms sermons, I do have more illustrations sprinkled through there. Also, I had so many verses to cover, more than I normally would preach through, that I knew if I could just get through this, it would be a victory. And so for that reason, I'm sure that I did not include one, although I had the William Booth. That was almost more of a quote than an illustration. Now, personal illustrations, I rarely use them. I think you can, and so I'm not emphatic that you cannot. I think there are certain principles about using yourself. Number one, I think they need to be fewer. Number two, they need to be self-deprecating rather than you're the hero of your own story. Number three, I tell you what really burns me is after I preach my heart out and the service is over and I'm out in the lobby and somebody comes up and they go, well, I had Mrs. Brown in the 5th grade too. It's just like, I just preached on heaven and hell and eternity, and you want to come up and talk to me about my personal illustration. I'm defeated. I don't like that as much. Having said that, I think that communication today tends to be more transparent, and that there is a time and a place to show transparency. But again, it needs to be done I think more rarely and carefully. I don't need to be telling you about my sins and that kind of thing. And this isn't a therapy session where I tell you about my struggles and let me throw up on you and you throw up on me, and aren't we all just close together? I don't like that kind of preaching. In fact, I want my pastor to be a godly man in the pursuit of holiness, and I don't need too much information about his shortcomings and struggles. I know that he has them. I do want to know him, and I may not be able to spend time with him, and so a personal illustration does let people into your life, which is good. But I would be... It just has to be done with great caution. With great caution.
I noticed on this second manuscript, there's a lot more highlights.
Yes.
Did you do that after the manuscript was finished? And are those just springboards for you like a launching pad?
Yeah, they are just to direct my eye. Although people in our church say when I die and they pass by the casket, that there will be a yellow highlighter in my hand as they come by to see me. What that means is I had more time after I finished the manuscript to be able to go back through it and give a little bit more meditative thought, and with a highlighter Other times when it's not highlighted, it usually means that I was in a crunch and I didn't have as much time to go back through and to highlight, is generally what that means. But it is a part of burning that into my mind and into my memory, to have that yellow highlighter. I don't know why, but it does have some kind of effect. But it also, as I'm standing in the pulpit, it draws my eye to what is primary. I mean, what I'm highlighting for me is I would be either reading it or drawing from it. It's more the emphatic parts. It's usually the subject and the verb, or a word like exclusively or inwardly, outwardly, eternally, where as I'm preaching, it's kind of, I push down on the gas pedal a little bit for those words. Those become highlighted.
Talked about, similar to Sam's question, knowing that there were ladies on the front row who were married to unbelievers.
Yeah.
And
actually, they're on the side section, a few rows back. I call it my widow's pew, and they just come by themselves.
Well, obviously you were anticipating the fact that, another point you made, that every preacher, every pastor has his own flock.
Yeah.
And so you're anticipating the effect that that's going to have on the people as you preach it.
Yeah.
Do you need to target in a way and think about, what's my week going to look like post this sermon? And does that affect the way you're laying it out and affect how you lay out your schedule, or perhaps the way you lay out, the counselors in your block going forward, knowing that you're going to preach that?
I guess because, as I said, I can only think about one thing at a time, what's immediately in front of me, and I can't think about what's on the left or the right, and I can't think about what's behind it. I don't really think about the week following after preaching that, not because I'm indifferent, it's just my gear shift can't shift to that, because I'm just obsessively focused upon this that's immediately in front of me. So I'm not really thinking about the ramifications or whatever, and not because I'm to this or to that. It's just I literally can't see beyond this. If I think of anything, it may be immediately after the sermon, and as I'm standing in the lobby and I'm wanting to talk to people and follow up from the sermon. But I can't really think out far ahead. Now, I have said things like at the end of the service, like if you need to be saved, if anyone needs to talk to me, and there are other elders and other people available, when I leave this pulpit, I'm going to be walking to the piano, and I'm going up the side aisle, and I'll be easy to access. I wouldn't leave here today without finalizing this with God, where you stand. And I'll tell them. So I'm kind of consciously aware that after it's over, I'll be doing that, and I want to be available and accessible. But that's as far as I can think.
With regards to emotion, the topic that you preach is really like preaching with emotion. Do you suppress your emotion, because I remember Paul when he's preaching with tears.
Yeah.
And that's the best topic that you will pour out your hearts to it.
Yes. So the question...
Do you suppress it? Or because, especially that you know that people who are listening are going to hell.
God has given us emotions. Emotions are not bad. I think we who are very exegetical, theological, cognitive, at times think of emotions as being carnal. And there is a lot of carnality involved in emotions. But I think that our emotions must be a part of our preaching. Obviously, there needs to be certain parameters. You don't need to be a distraction to people. I mean, people need to be able to hear you and to listen to you. And but I think that there are times that our flock needs to see us weep, needs to hear us cry. And I do, and I don't know, I don't have an on switch. I mean, I don't, in fact, I hate to cry. I mean, it's just uncomfortable. I mean, it's almost like throwing up. I mean, it's just emotionally disturbing. It's not a pleasant experience. And yet there are times that I do cry as I preach. And I think I should at those times for me. Another preacher might not, and that's fine. It shouldn't be a distraction, and I don't know when it's going to come. I didn't cry on this, and at other times I'll preach something, and it just crushes me. And I don't know why or when, it just happens. So, I mean, you just have to be yourself. I tend to try to suppress it just because I hate to cry. And whenever I do, my voice drops so low, and then the person up in the balcony turns the volume so loud, and then I finally break out of that and say something, and it's so loud that we're just jarred by it, and he's quickly turning it down. And then I start to cry again, and he turns it back up. And I think it's good if that's genuine and if that's real, for people to see that in you, if it's real and if it's genuine, and it's not something you should ever try to do. And again, I don't even like it.
Lawson, you touched on it a little bit, but in your years you've been preaching, how have you responded to criticism, whether it's something you said doctrinally, your style, lack of saying something, whatever the case? What advice would you have for that?
Oh, I wish I could say I just rise above it and it has no effect on me, and it's a badge of honor. But it does affect me at times to a certain degree, not a great degree, but to a certain degree. Number one, it depends on the source. It depends on who it is. I mean, if it's John MacArthur who comes up and says, "You missed the whole point," well, that's going to devastate me. That would have an effect on me. I can't say it has no effect on me. If it's somebody that I know is not saved, or I think they're not saved, or if it's somebody who, who's a CEO in the church, Christmas and Easter only, then, this really has little effect. Number one, I consider the source. Number two, I really do think about what they've said. So I never just brush it off. And I think we should process what was said. Number three, I think of 1 Corinthians 4, verse 5, where 4 or 5, Paul says, "I consider it a very small thing that I should be, whatever by you." What is the word there? Judged by you. And verse 3, "But to me it is a very small thing that I may be examined by you." And so there's an element of that. There's also, I'm learning, I learn a lot by what people come up and say. And as I begin to hear something repeated, then there's probably something to this. If it's just one person, I kind of need another one to line up with that. If over the course of a month, 3 people say the same thing, like I'm insensitive, or I never do this, or I never do that, then I probably need to take that to heart and examine myself. And and present that to the Lord and say, God, there's something here, and if I genuinely am convicted, confess that to God and ask God to remove that from my life. I also know that there's a little man syndrome in the world, and somebody's a nobody at work, and he's a nobody at home, and nobody listens to him, and he's a gopher at work, and he's a gopher at home, and he comes to church, and it's some place where somebody will finally listen to him. And he wants to throw his weight around. And he likes having the microphone. He likes having the spotlight. He likes for someone to give attention. His wife doesn't pay any attention to him. His boss doesn't pay any attention to him. The people he works with doesn't. And sometimes people are jealous of you. I mean, your wife comes to church. Your wife is submissive and gracious. Your children support you, and his wife doesn't, and his children don't. And there's kind of an inbred jealousy. I mean, you really have to. You just can't swallow every fly that comes flying past you, and you have to discern and sift through that. I would literally, I would be paralyzed if I actually took deeply to heart everything that is said to me. I would be a basket case. And so you have to learn how to have a soft heart and thick skin. And that's kind of a hard balance to maintain. To maintain sensitivity, and yet to be steadfast and to be persevering. And so I just really have to think through who this is and what they're saying and who they are and why they've said this, and just exegete that whole thing. I mean, Peter said, God forbid, may it never be so, and Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. And so I need to try to have some discernment. Is this Satan actually trying to block me from moving forward to preach this? Is this God actually sending someone to temper me and to soften me? And I Peter was a pretty, noteworthy person. I mean, he wasn't a back row Baptist, back there someplace. I mean, he's the lead apostle. He's the one who's saying, God forbid, may it never be so. And yet Satan was speaking right through him, impeding his progress to the cross. So it's not a simple matter. And sometimes I'll share it with my wife. And I'm a kind of person, I get something in my mind, I can't get it out of my mind. I mean, my strength is my weakness. And when I get locked onto something, remember I said I get locked onto something, I can't think about what's on the right, can't think about what's on the left, I can't think about the next thing. I mean, it's just like I'm boring a hole in it as I'm looking at it, thinking about it, wake up thinking about it. So if that happens to be right in front of me, it can be counterproductive. I think as a general rule, things are never as bad as other people come up and tell you they are. And things are never as good as other people come up and tell you they are. I mean, it's usually kind of somewhere in the middle. And, someone will come up and say, everyone thinks whatever. Everyone doesn't think that. And then you just say, can you give me one name? Well, I can't give those names. Well, just give me one. Give me their initials. And it's usually his wife who's frustrated about something. And it's not everybody. And so people exaggerate the truth. So you have to whittle it down and find in the middle of all that, the core of truth. The coal in the midst of the snowball of what was thrown at you. Yes, sir.
Kind of along with that, if you get an email from someone in your church about your sermon, how much time do you give to that or interact with that?
Yeah. First of all, I would prefer it to be in an email, because that contains the time. It would take them 20 times longer to verbally tell me than, you're talking about still criticism, let's say? Yeah. I can get it much quicker in print, so I thank you for putting it in print. Second, it does make you think more carefully when you have to put it in print. You don't write with hyperbole as much as you speak with hyperbole. Third, this now allows me to respond in print, probably, and so that decompresses the pressure of the situation to be able to respond in print, where that person's not sitting right there and by body language, etc., express their frustration. So it's easier to be meditative, contemplative, and in writing this out, to begin with a positive and work to, a negative or whatever. So would I respond? Yes, if they sign it. It obviously would depend upon what they say. So, obviously, anything that would be anonymous, I would just immediately throw away. My secretary knows to not even let me see it, because I can get locked in on something like that, and that's not for the spiritual good of our church. It's not spiritually healthy for me. So if you don't sign it, it's just immediately discarded, thrown away. So I don't know if that's helpful or not. I don't need to know everything. Don't want to know everything. So not all things are profitable, Paul says.
You just mentioned a few minutes ago about Satan. Is this like, a couple days ago you talked about if you felt resistance in the pulpit, you would be inclined to interpret that as spiritual warfare. Could you address maybe spiritual warfare and the preacher, either like during your preparation or right before or during you preach? Is that something you give a lot of thought to?
I don't give a lot of thought to it, Steve, but I am aware of it. I mean, I've written a commentary on the book of Job, and I've written a book on the book of Job, and so I'm aware of. I've preached through the book of Job, so I'm aware of spiritual warfare. I think it's more spiritually healthy to focus on Christ than on Satan, and I know you would agree with that. I'm really not someone who sees a demon behind every bush and that kind of thing. But as I approach the pulpit, whether it's a day before, the night before, the morning of, I am consciously aware at times that certain conflict, certain disruptions are very unusual, and I do stop and consider that this really may be Satan's opposition to me, to get me off my game, to get me in the flesh, to get me off message, to preach with anger, to preach with overreaction, to preach with whatever. And I have to be consciously aware of that. I obviously we can't see the devil, and we subjective can only go so far, and so I don't know, and I don't really I rarely think that was Satan that said that, pointing to that person. That's a very rare thing. And so beyond that, I just have to keep the full armor of God on. And it should drive me to prayer. And if anything, resistance should make us more intentional and purposeful. I'm a very competitive person from background with sports. And, the first church that I pastored, the pulpit committee, I remember the chairman of the pulpit committee said, we don't know if you're whatever to be able to take on this church, and it had lots of problems. Well, that just punched my competitive button, and maybe I should have prayed more, but, well, if you tell me I can't, then I will. That's a really mature attitude, and using child psychology with me to get me to go. So in those situations, it still has a tendency, just by the DNA of my personality, then I'm gonna be all the more determined to run the race, to win. And I believe in, greater is He who is in the world. Greater is He who is in you than he who is in the world. 1 John 4:4. So, we do come at this from a superior position because of who indwells us. Yeah.
You mentioned being tempted to preach in anger,
yeah,
kind of thing. Maybe could you talk about just some of the pitfalls of approaches in preaching that to watch out for as you're preparing?
Yeah. Well, rule number 1 is you can never preach a sermon to one person. Rule number 2 is don't ever forget rule number 1. So it never works, and I've done it before as a young man, even unintentionally. Nevertheless, when you stand in the pulpit, you're aware of that person and what you're having to say and whatever, and so I've just had to learn the hard way by falling on my own sword that it's pointless. It doesn't work. It's the person that I don't think I'm not even aware of, is the one who comes up and responds to the message, and the one I was trying to reach does not respond to the message, and so the wind blows wherever it wills. And so that's one huge thing to remember. My wife has had to learn not to say anything really of any significance to me from noon on Saturday to noon on Monday. I'm just kind of in the zone, and we talk and whatever, but it's not a time to bring up someone in the church who's not doing right, because that'll just get under my skin, whatever. And I don't need that. The church doesn't need that. And so she's a very good guard and would wait and tell me or make me aware of things. The elders in our church know what a focused person I am, and my secretary does, and so that timing's everything, and when things are made known to you. But before you go up in the pulpit is not that time. There have been, I'm sure, some times, I can't think of it at the moment, and it's probably by God's grace, I can't remember, when I have preached in frustration. And that's not a good thing, although I have preached with righteous indignation, and that was a good thing. Jesus cleansing the temple, and I have preached in a righteous anger at times, but a fleshly anger is a horrible thing. And the man who cannot control his own spirit, is like the castle that can easily be broken into. I think that's why our own hearts just really must be at peace with God and right before God. And if there's somebody you need to call before you step in to preach, the Matthew 5, if you're aware that someone has something against you. Well, number one, I've had so many people against me at different times that I would never preach. If I could spend the rest of my life just going to people who are frustrated with me. But I can't let my enemies set my agenda. And so I have to, again, consider the source, and I can only do what I can. But there are times when I do call someone, or I have to go to someone and ask for their forgiveness, or I'm aware that I sense, I could be wrong, but I sense there's no eye contact, that I've done something, and I'll do it in a self-deprecating way. I'm sure I've done something of which I'm not aware, rather than saying, why do you have a bad attitude towards me? I want to come ready to be a repenter. I am sure that I must have done something of which I'm not aware, and I want to make it right with you if I have. It seems like there's been a distance between us. Would you please tell me what that is so that I can take that out of the way by asking you to forgive me? And give them every opportunity to do that. And I can only do what I can do. And once I've done that, then I've turned the matter over to the Lord and turned them over to the Lord. But there have been times when it's been a sweet reconciliation Now, this doesn't happen a lot, and in part, I'm not spiritual enough to be that sensitive. But when I have, it's a wonderful thing to then come to church and know that things have been right. And sometimes I'll even catch them in the lobby and see them and just go over to them and express something and just try to say it in a humble way. I just don't feel like I can preach today if there's a friction or an irritation between us, and have I been short with you? Have I been unkind? And if so, I just really need to make that right before I step into the pulpit. And I think when we initiate with humility, people generally respond with a soft answer. But when we come, kind of intense, then they usually respond being intense. And generally there's not a resolution to the problem. So
Tuesday you talked a little bit about thinking in advance and kind of deciding how you're going to divide up a book that you're going to preach, or whatever the next section that you're going to preach is, the next series. I'm wondering if you could walk us through practically just how far out do you plan your preaching calendar? How do you decide what you're going to preach when? And how do you decide, I want to preach this in 24 messages or 48 messages?
Yeah, that's a great question. All right, here's what's funny. Not only do I not have a preaching calendar, I don't even have a calendar. So I don't even have a calendar, period. Now, my secretary has a calendar. My wife has a calendar. My daughter, who works for me, has a calendar. The seminary here has a calendar. Ligonier has a calendar. My publishers have a calendar. There are lots of calendars around me, but I don't have a calendar. So, as far as preaching in advance, and it's kind of like balancing your checkbook. It's depressing sometimes just to balance your checkbook. I'd just rather not know. Because I am controlled by my circumstances, and I just would rather not know, so I'm just not going to balance it. And the calendar sometimes is that way for me. Now, it's written down, and my secretary has it, and my wife has it, and other people have it, but if I was just like looking at this all the time, I think I would just freeze. As far as, will this be 24 messages or 30 messages? For me, preaching is such an adventure into the unknown. I have no idea. I couldn't possibly know how many sermons this will be. And I will even say sometimes in the pulpit, I just want to start a short series. Well, as soon as I say that, half of the church is just smiling from ear to ear and shaking their head no. They know this isn't going to be a short series. I am naive enough to think it is going to be a short series, and they know me better than I know myself. And it becomes a long series. I don't know how to do that. I really don't. And I don't know, when I dig into this, how much gold there is in those mountains until I get it out. And again, I don't know how to think out ahead. And so I can't think past this sermon and the beginning of this series. It's just hard for me to know. I never plan it correctly. It's almost like opposite day. Sometimes with my kids, I'd play opposite day. It's just the opposite. I think it's going to be long, ends up being short. I think it's going to be short, ends up being long. And there's just this unknown factor for me in preaching. And I think kind of at the end of the day, I really am just kind of a starving artist on the side of the road trying to sell my Elvis paintings on black velvet. There's a part of like putting my notes together and the whole thing. There's an artist part. How long does it take to paint the Mona Lisa? I don't know. It's going to take. I'm going to take as long as it will take to paint the Mona Lisa. I have no idea how long it's going to take. I can't. I don't know how to program me. I'm not mechanical. I'm more intuitive.
be about a new book? Like if you're going to preach a new book.
Well, if I'm going to preach a new book, I do need to know what's in this book, and I'll read NTI and OTI or whichever it is, and study Bibles and all the rest. I really wish I could give you this phenomenal answer that, like, 3 years out ahead, I'm reading this and there's Scotch tape on the wall around me and it's just constantly before me. But my life is just from one emergency to the next emergency, and I just live in final exam week, and it's hard to think about next week's final exam when I'm in this week's final exam. So I would say, for something like that, a couple of weeks, no more than a month. And I almost say that a little tongue-in-cheek. And I wish I could tell you that, I've gone to the top of a mountain and been there alone with God for a month, and I've read through everything, and I've come down with this on tablets. It really, and also I work best under pressure. You need to know yourself. Some people cannot work under pressure. Other people work better under pressure. Well, it's just my personality. I'm an old athlete. With 1 second to go in the game, I want the ball in my hands. I concentrate better if everything is riding on this one shot and there's 1 second to go in the game. And if there's 8 minutes to go in the game, I'm yawning. It's just hard for me to lock in. So I'm not writing my sermon, on Monday or Tuesday. I do better in the crisis of the moment. I don't know if it's an adrenaline rush, if there's a stimulation that comes from that, if I have an ADD mind and I'm able to be more riveted and more focused. But I need to feel pressure in order to rise to a higher level of productivity. But that's just me. And it creates stress for everyone else around me as I live in this. Can I just lay down right here and just kind of group therapy?
Speaking of that, if you preach Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday night,
yeah,
and you've been telling us that you focus on one thing at a time, I'm just trying to, could you elaborate a little bit on, and I know you've obviously gotten more efficient over the years you've been with experience, but when do you start working on your Sunday morning and then switch gears to Sunday evening and then switch gears to Wednesday evening?
Yeah. Well, this, as I say some of this, it's just you're just gonna shake your head and wonder why you're in my class and I'm your professor. Like physician, heal yourself. Well, to throw into that, on Sunday morning, Sunday night, I've also been teaching Sunday school right before I preach on Sunday. So just kind of like throw that one in the mix as well. And they tape me and video me for Sunday school. So that's why I have a little twitch in my neck. And well, I will begin Sunday. This is the way it is now. It didn't used to be this way. And it used to be nobody wanted me to come preach in other places. Nobody had any book deadlines for me and stuff like that. So I literally used to preach on Sunday night, and as soon as I had finished, I would walk back into my office there at the church and just pull down all of my commentaries and Xerox everything that I needed for the next Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. Had 3 folders. I also did a men's study downtown on Friday. So I would just Xerox everything that I needed, and I had a little briefcase, and I carried those 3 or 4 folders, really 4, with me all week, and would just kind of be, pushing them along in stages, almost like someone reading 4 books at one time, a little bit here, a little bit there, and just pushing them along. So that's the way I started out, and that probably would most relate to the men here. So as soon as it was over, I'm into it. It's like Nick Saban, win the national championship, we'll take one day off, and in 2 days we're focused on the next one. And so I would leave Sunday night with everything I needed for the next week. And I had little children at home, and they were crying at home. And the church that I pastored had an elementary school that had 400 kids, and my office was just right in the middle of recess. And the only place I could study was at Arby's. And so I got in the back booth at Arby's, and the waitresses all knew me, and I would rent the space there by getting a coffee. I mean, it's true. I lived my life for 10 years that way. I wrote my first several books in the back booth at Arby's. I would carry my little ink bottle with me and had my fountain pen, and I wrote all of my sermons and all of my handouts and everything in the back booth at Arby's. And I just had to, because I needed a place where I didn't have crying kids and soccer balls and everything banging against windows. So now my world is, it's just totally different, and I'm glad for that. But right now, I'll start Sunday on Thursday morning. I get up very early, and I full court press, and I can bore a hole in something for about 6 hours until I need to blink, and then just blink and then go at it again. I know myself on Saturday that I need to get Sunday night. In that sense, I do a lot of the heavy lifting, Thursday, Friday, but Saturday, I need to go ahead and focus on Sunday night, because once I get locked in on Sunday morning, it's just, I won't be able to think about anything else. So I just kind of have to learn myself on that. Teaching Sunday school, I taught through the book of Revelation for over a course of 3 years, and so I would just Xerox the MacArthur commentary, underline it, draw circles, whatever, get my little piece of paper, go down the left side and behold, draw a line and what that meant. I come quickly, little line, what that meant. My reward is with me, dun, 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 to give to whomever. And I would just stand up with 2 pages, but it was Sunday school. And I've taught the book of Revelation multiple times. And so I would teach something that I've already have preached through and taught. I know this book fairly well. So usually that would be, to fly from DFW to Mobile is 1 hour and 55 minutes. And so in the course of that time, I can underline my MacArthur commentary and scribble out my little notes and take maybe just a little bit longer the next morning, and I'm kind of good to go for Sunday school. For Sunday morning in the pulpit, it takes longer, and introductions, conclusions, and all those things. But coming into Monday, I'm writing books, I'm writing articles, I'm writing chapters, I'm returning emails. Emails are unbelievable. Anybody in the world can just send you an email. It used to be you had to get in a car and drive to see me, or write a letter and mail it, and it would get there in 4 days or whatever. And now, people can just access you at any point from anywhere in the world, and you need to answer this and respond to this. So it just takes a lot of time on that. So I've told you before, give your mornings to God, your afternoons to men, your evenings to your family. It's just kind of a general framework, and that's just kind of how I do it. I don't really know how I do it. I just do it. And the fear of God is a motivating force and factor, and I just have to be prepared. I've got to do this right for the glory of God, and I just do it. So I study on airplanes, I study in airports, I study in hotel rooms, I study just here and there and everywhere, and you just get it done.
You don't take an official day off. You have evening family time. There's quality time there, time for rest.
I right now, I used to take a day off constantly. I had little kids at home, my wife. Sunday is King's Day. Monday is Queen's Day. And my wife and I would do this and that together. We'd have one of our kids with us, but now all of my kids are gone, and it's different. And my wife goes to see her mother, who's about to die a lot. And I don't know. In my heart, I really feel I know it's not a theological category in Ephesians 4, but I really do feel like I'm a reformer in some ways. And so I think we're wound up tighter, and some people just do more than others, and I'm just wound up rather tight. And I take great pleasure I love doing this. I live for this. I've spent 40 years of my life to get to this point, to be able to stand in front of you and say something. I mean, I've gone through, 33 years of pastoring a church, and so I just want to, I didn't take this Monday off. I mean, because I want to be here in the classroom with you. And so certain things let go. So I tend to, there'll be parentheses of 3 days here. I'll fly someplace and go there 2 days early, ask my wife to go with me. I go overseas and preach. I'll go overseas, I think 4 times this coming year. I went overseas 3 times last year. Take my wife with me. And so, these become extended times together, and she's ready for some distance from me, after going to all the places. I say that tongue-in-cheek. We had wonderful time. But the more I preach and the more I study, the more excited and enthused I am. And I don't know. I'm just, Churchill said when he became Prime Minister of England, he said, all of my life, at age 69, all my life has been a preparation for this one moment in time. I feel the same way about me, that all my life has been a preparation for this one moment at a time. So I just want to do all that I can for God while I can. And I won't have much time left. And I want to sprint to the finish. So, anyway, that's probably more of an answer. Don't be like me, really. Just honestly, you've got to take days off and slower pace, but the more I do, the more it winds me up, the more I want to do for God. And I read. How did Calvin do all that? How did Luther do all? It's impossible what you did. Spurgeon preached every day. Lloyd Jones preached virtually every day. Calvin did preach every day, every other week. He preached 354 consecutive sermons through Isaiah. How did you do that? At 6 a.m. in the morning and 7 a.m. In the winter. He preached 200 consecutive sermons through Deuteronomy. How did you do that? How did you walk across the street and then go into the auditoire and lecture, and they're taking it all down, and it becomes your 22-volume commentary set? And it's really 40-plus volumes. We just have compressed it down to 22. You're just a prolific individual. How does MacArthur do what he does? You just jump into the deep end and you just do it. But you're at a certain point in life. I didn't live like this when I was 30.
Obviously, you're in the Word all the time studying for these messages. Do you consider that your personal devotions, or do you have some kind of other, Bible reading plan? Or?
Yeah, I do. My one technological thing, I have a Kindle reader, which is an amazing invention. It's like, have you heard about these? Like, how'd you get that in there? That's... Who's in there? Is there somebody with a flashlight in there? How do you do that? So I've got this Kindle reader now, and I can carry that around with me, and so I'm just reading through the Bible on this Kindle reader. It's easier for me to read with my eyes, especially at night. And so I'm just trying to read the portions in the Bible I am least familiar with, to try to fill in my gaps as best I can. So I'm not allowing myself to go to the Gospel of John, which is my favorite book, right now I'm in 2nd Chronicles, and I'm just trying to read through the Old Testament and just to fill in all my gaps as best I can. And yes, it's very devotional, just like it is for you. It is for me, and I'm just like constantly learning. And I'm not outlining sermons and that kind of thing. I'm just like noting whatever the Spirit of God is just emphasizing in my heart as I read this. So, yeah, I mean, I do that. I do read at other times devotionally, but it's more with this Kindle and just traveling with it and having, the Bible, and the MacArthur Study Bible, and you hit the little blue thing and it gives you the footnote, and you hit another little thing and you go back to the text, and so it's a great way to keep reading. Christian biography is very devotional for me as well. I mean, it just fires me up. I mean, it does something. It stirs me in my heart. It's not the Word of God, but seeing the Word of God in the lives of other people, it's very inspirational. It's very motivational. It's very convicting. It's very challenging. And so I love reading, Christian biographies. That has a devotional effect. And I probably, the Psalms, I mean, I try to pray through Psalms, and that has a real devotional effect as well. And I mean, sometimes I've just got so much on my mind, if I just like close my eyes and like, let me just pray. I mean, I've got so many things going on in my mind that to take a psalm and start in verse 1 and just pray through it, where the structure and the content is already there, and to make it personal and to pray it to God and, filter it through my own heart and life. It's just an aid where I'm not going in circles in the wilderness, trying to pray. So, yeah.
Could you describe what on a Sunday morning, I mean, we were talking earlier about preparation for the pulpit or spiritual warfare.
Yeah.
Are you generally at church significantly earlier than when you preach? Are you there sooner? Some pastors, they may lead the worship, so that's on their mind as well. Some just preach. Yeah. What's your normal Sunday look like in terms of showing up and?
Yeah, my Sunday, and so many times I've just flown in on Saturday night, and it's hard for me to go to sleep. I have to read myself to sleep. So when I wake up is dependent upon when I go to sleep. I try to wake up, kind of early. It depends on what final preparation needs to be made. I mean, it could be 4 o'clock, it could be 5 o'clock, it could be 6 o'clock, it could be 3 o'clock. I mean, it just really depends where I am with this and what final fine-tuning needs to happen. Sunday school is at 9 o'clock, and the worship service is at 10:30. And so if I'm on for Sunday school, and I do it in just kind of, for 4 years, something like that, and take off. And right now I've taken off, and I may be stepping back in. Then I would come, be there 5 minutes, 10 minutes before Sunday school starts. And it's kind of good to be just around the lectern, and people can touch you and talk to you, and you're accessible, and that's good. And teach, and then afterwards people can come up and interact with you, and then walk upstairs. We're down in the basement, and then walk upstairs to the sanctuary, and it's just a good time to try to shake as many hands and speak to as many people and have an eye out for visitors. And it seems like there's always, several visitors who are traveling through town and listen on sermon audio and want to come by, and so I try to be accessible to them. If I'm not teaching Sunday school, church starts at 10:30. I'll be there by about 10 o'clock and just circulate and talk and visit and meet, and that's good for people, and it's good for me. And the service begins at 10:30. It's over at 12. I could preach a little longer, and 5 after, 10 after, and when it's over, I'm usually the last person to leave. I'll leave at 1 o'clock or 12:30 or 12:45, and it just depends on who's there and who wants to talk to me. And I'd really rather talk to you right now than you set up an appointment on Tuesday and come back and this take an hour. Let me just talk to you right now, and I'll give you, and when I talk to someone, because of what I said earlier, you have my undivided attention. I'm all here. I can't think about what's on the other side of you, who's standing on your left or right. I mean, I'm listening. I'm listening to what you're saying. But it tends to be able, I can do it in 10 to 15 minutes where it would take an hour if you come by my office. So, Lloyd Jones did a lot of his counseling that way. He would go back to his office, and people would just line up to interact with him, and they would be told if he remains seated, then you may sit down. If he stands up, then he's going to be ushering you out, and he's just reading people as they come in, who really needs to talk to him and who doesn't really need to talk to him. And so I'm doing that after church as well. I try to be sensitive to the broken heart and to the one who feels some urgency to talk to me. And if somebody's wanting to come up, kind of like this other question, want to talk to me about Hades and some question like that, I don't have time for that. I mean, there's just too many needs that need to be addressed in people's lives. And so I'm trying to, with discernment, and people are bringing people up to me as well. And there are certain deacons in our church who have the gift of mercy and are very helpful, and they're meeting people, and they bring people up to me as well that I want to talk to. My wife is kind of circulating and talking, and she's able to help me. Who needs a call? Who needs a card? Who needs a note? Who needs for me to pay attention to them? They're trying to get your attention. I mean, she told me about this little boy. I went up to the Awana thing the other night. I don't really ever do this. Went up there on a Friday night and shot basketballs with the kids in Awana, kind of because my wife made me do this. And so I went up and did it, and it's just like, oh my goodness, all these little kids just loved it to death. And so after that, all these little kids are coming up on Sunday, and now that they think that we're big buddies now, And my wife is pointing out, did you realize little Andrew Eckerman was trying to get your attention? And if you would speak to him, who knows, he might be, the next preacher to come out of here. So, okay, so woman, it's not my hour. So I have help from people to try to, connect with people. I do think after you preach in the heat of the moment, people have heard the Word of God. They may be under the conviction of the Holy Spirit. That is a time, the iron is hot. You need to press. Behold, now is the accepted time. Behold, today is the day of salvation. So I just want to be available. So that's when I get there, and that's when I leave. I go home, and I'm 61 years old. I get tired. And I go home just like collapse. And I've got this red chair, and I just collapse. And it's just, exhausting.
Have a guy that comes up and just wants to talk about Hades or about whatever. Or like you mentioned, you preach a message like you did today, and you want people who want to repent, who want to come to Christ, but you got people that just want to talk for a reason. How do you navigate that person?
Yeah, I'll still talk to that person on Hades, provided someone's not trying to get to me. And I love young men and who come up to ask me questions, and I've got them. And there are some young men. They all sit on the front row, and if I would stand there for 3 hours, they would stand there for 3 hours. Well, that's good. That energizes me. I like that. It doesn't drain me. It energizes me. And they do ask sometimes obtuse questions. But when I can see behind them over their shoulders someone else just standing there shyly wanting to talk to me, usually those are the ones like Spurgeon talked about. The wounded deer wants to withdraw to the thicket to be by themselves, to lick their wounds. They humbly are waiting, and I can see them. And so I try to disconnect from them, and I may even say, hey, just a minute, I'll come back, or I'll say, hey, walk with me. And as I walk over to that person in transition, I don't want them to feel like I'm abruptly unplugging and pulling out. And I do say that. I say that a lot on this campus, and people come up and walk, and I know that I'm supposed to be someplace in literal. I'm already 2 minutes late, but I don't want to for them to feel like it was a brush off. So just come walk with me, so I can keep moving in that direction. And I do that on Sunday, with people as well, just kind of going from point A to point B and try to be inclusive on that. It's very important, more so than what I realize. Yeah.
As you've kind of become higher profile with being an author and all that, do you find that it draws a certain kind of guy to your church? Like, are there guys that want to be there just because of that? Because and they want to talk to you just because, your name's on a book? And how do you...
not really. Honestly, in Mobile, I'm a nobody. In Mobile. And so there really aren't people like that flying around. Hey, I'm a nobody wherever I am, as far as that goes. And the ones who are there, it's really because they liked what I said, and they have a passion for God, and they want the Word brought strong to them. And so, I don't have a study Bible. I don't have a commentary set. I don't have all those things. And so there's really not... There's not that. Nobody's wanting to hang out just because they think something. I think it's because they heard the truth and they've been drawn by the truth. I could be naive on that, but I don't think I've missed that. There really aren't. My preaching generally runs off people like that. My preaching usually, if you're still with me, then I think you're getting this, and you're here for the right reason. I've had guys come sit on the front row, have their hat on backwards, and just kind of try to be Joe Cool. They only last, 1 or 2 weeks under that. The immaturity of that. Kyle.
Obed said he'd buy me a Diet Coke if I got your attention to that.
Oh, okay. This is Philip. People are coming to Philip to. Yeah, I am so sorry. Part of it's because I'm right-handed, and you gesture with your right hand, and you just kind of end up going like that. And I'm conservative, and liberal is left, and. When he separates the sheep, the goats are on the left, and.
I just want to ask about jealousy, and I know you speak at different conferences, and I know you've been preaching for a while, and we all struggle with jealousy, but I want to ask about how you as a preacher, how you deal with it, if you struggle with it, but yeah, so if you go to an event and someone's more popular or someone gets more attention, how do you deal with that?
I'm just used to it. Everybody is more popular, and everybody gets more attention than me. Yeah, sure. But I know where I am on the food chain. Really, I can't believe you invited me to come speak. I'm just so overwhelmed and humbled that I got to the dance. That somebody invited me to the dance. That's amazing. I know what it's like just to go to the conference. For me to get to preach at the conference. So no, it doesn't really. That doesn't bother me at all, because I once heard myself preach for about 30 seconds, and it's depressing, and it's like I'm in shock that you would invite me in some ways, really. And I think other men are so gifted, and I've been crushed a lot in ministry as well, going through crisis situations. I've been put out of a church. I've I've left another church under just kind of painful circumstances, and those have a church before. I've never left a church as a hero, and so those have a way of just reminding you. I mean, you can't get away from it. It's kind of like a ball and chain around you. I mean, it's crushed you. It's a part of you. I mean, there's scars. So I just remember that. I do. So, Paul talks about being crushed. So that has a way of, like, if somebody says something, it's hard to even receive a compliment, really. It's not like you just like suck these up like a vacuum cleaner. It's just like, I apologize almost when people try to give you a compliment. It wasn't really that good. I'm sorry. I wish I could have preached it better. And I'm a perfectionist, and I can't ever get it right enough for me. So I'm my own worst critic, and even when people are gracious and kind and say kind things, I still wish I had done it better. And so it's that art part of preaching that someone with my temperament, just kind of an obsessive perfectionist. People give me Christmas presents. I never take the tags off, the price, so I can go back and swap it and exchange it, because I always think there's another better shirt or a better tie or a better this. And so it's just a crazy way to go through life. And so I'm that way with my sermons. And, if I could preach that again, I would do it better. I could do it better, and I can't be satisfied till I can do it better. So I don't go around I don't look in the mirror and go, how great thou art. I just I can't believe that I'm a preacher. I didn't come from a family of preachers. I didn't grow up in a Bible preaching church. I never sat under Bible preaching until I was in my 20s. So I'm just still so late to the dance, to the party, that I'm just kind of glad to get to the party before the party's over. Really. So but it's not like I always just have humble thoughts, but those are very real thoughts for me.
Yeah, early on in these sessions, you really hit on the fear of man versus the fear of God, and how if you have a right fear of God, then you really, your passion or all of those things will be dealt with properly. And so I wonder if you could even expand on that.
Expand on
how do you, in interacting with the guys here, everybody here that I know has a fear of God, and why they're here is because they have a fear of God. But in increasing that still, we want to continue to increase that, because the times that we're living in are such that we're going to be faced with a greater potential, I think, for the fear of man. And so just developing that greater fear of God in our devotion and in our preparation for preaching, if you would,
Yeah, and just even off the top of my head, a couple of things. One is, I really do believe we will stand at the judgment seat of Christ. And I really do believe, 2 Corinthians 5:10, therefore we shall all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. I think the we refers to all the elect, all the believers. And my sin will not be brought up, but as a servant to his master, I will have to give an account for how faithful I've been with what has been entrusted to me. And I really wanted to preach on that a couple years ago at Shepherd's Conference and preach a sermon entitled That Final Day, when every minister will give an account to his master for his doctrine, for his teaching, for his motives, for his methods. And that is a gripping reality for me, that final day is coming. And he will test the quality of each man's work. Not the quantity, the quality. And sometimes it's easy to hide behind the quantity. Our numbers are up. We have more. But it's the quality. Did we build with gold, silver, and precious stones, or wood, hay, and stubble? And so I think that we should be awestruck that we're going to stand before our Master and give an account for the use of our time, the use of our gifts, the use of our influence, the whole thing. And it's going to be one-on-one. That's one thing. Another thing that I think really becomes lost today in some of the new Calvinism is this thought that God could never be displeased with me, that God loves me so perfectly. It really is one step away from antinomianism, and I think does pull some people into antinomianism. And sometimes a Christian leader can run right up to a cliff and stop, but the people who are following him keep on running and they go over the edge of the cliff. And I hear, and probably a lot of guys that you listen to, I think a lot of young guys in their 20s and 30s are listening to some of these guys, and they grew up in fundamental churches, and they're kind of wanting to just to cut the shackles of a lot of that and just get rid of any sense of guilt or conviction, and have just settled into a passivity, and it's opened up Christian liberty too much. And so they've swung the pendulum way far in the other direction. And I often say to my wife that there's no fear of God in these people. And there's no fear of God being communicated from the pulpit. It's just all, He can't love us anymore, He can't love us any less, He loves us perfectly, it doesn't matter what we do, He accepts us in Christ. And to a point, all of that is true, but it's only to a point. And we need to strive to please the Lord, because He's displeased with sin. He's displeased with bad teaching. He's displeased with unfaithfulness. He's displeased with you when you fail Him with your slothfulness, with your undisciplined Christian life, when you squander opportunities and your time. I think that is unplugging today with an entire younger generation a healthy, holy fear of God. And for some reason, they just want to run in another direction. I was hearing a man preach at a conference I was at, and in that sermon, he said something to the effect, these aren't the exact words, but my wife and I went to a movie the other night, but I'm not going to tell you what it was because you would think whatever, and just kind of laughed about it. And I thought, wow, you just opened Pandora's box to all of these young people that it really doesn't matter what movie you go to. Now, in some sense, even as I hear myself saying it, it's just like, wow, you really are kind of a dinosaur, or you really are just kind of an old school guy or whatever. But, have we come that far that it really doesn't matter what you set in front of your eyes? It does matter what you set in front of your eyes. And if it doesn't pass Philippians 4:8, we have no business putting it in front of our eyes. And so I do think that there's no fear of God in them, and that's why in the pulpits they really become jokesters, storytellers, entertainers, communicators, captive personalities. And I just don't see any fear of God. And when there's no fear of God, and let me remind all of us, it's not just Old Testament texts that talk about the fear of God. New Testament texts talk about the fear of God. 2 Corinthians 7:1 and 1 Peter 1 and verse 17, and just on and on and on. Where there's no fear of God, there's no gravitas. And the word gravitas means gravity. There's no weightiness. And so therefore, just spiritual lightweights in pulpits. So we really need the burden of the Lord, the weightiness, and the fear of God is a part of that. And so many today they just don't want the fear of God. I don't know how you can get away from that. And the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. You come to the end of Ecclesiastes, and it's the end of wisdom, and it's everything in between. So you don't grow out of the fear of God. You don't grow into the fear of God. I mean, when you were saved, there was the fear of God in saving faith. No one giggled their way through the narrow gate. Blessed are they who mourn. And we grow in reverence for God. So, I thank you for that question, and maybe I've kind of already answered it, but I think that is a massive issue today. And I'm not talking about swinging the pendulum so far over here that a worship service is like a funeral or whatever. I'm not talking about that. I don't want that. But I think we as spiritual leaders must have a gravity about us, as we have joy, as we have humor. But there are certain checks to that. When someone's about to do brain surgery on you, you don't want him to come up and say, "Have you heard the one about the 3 Baptists?" I want this to be the most serious day in your life. When you get on the airplane, you don't want the pilot to have, one of those glasses, nose, and a mustache on. You want him to think this is the most serious mission in his life. And I think the one who ministers to the soul ought to come across with the fear of the Lord. So, that's greatly needed. And those are just a couple things that I would say.
Other than the Psalms and the prophecy and stuff, I think you said something yesterday about how you would approach a systematic theology or a biographical sketch. And also, there's got to be some wisdom in deciding when to teach what. Like, everybody laughs about how you can't go into a church and teach Calvinism right away, or you're going to make people mad. When, like John Piper says, people don't want you to be a system man, they want you to be a Bible man. So, you see...
I think people are going to be upset with your preaching Calvinism, whether you preach it when you get there or later or in between. And they did it to Jesus in John 6. They withdrew from him and would not walk with him any longer. I think we do need to be sensitive and establish a beachhead and that kind of thing. I think every church is different, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer to that. And I've tried to be gracious and long-suffering and wait until I bring out the crown jewels, so that people can mature a little bit more to come to that point, and still all hell broke loose. And I was taught in seminary that if you preach the doctrines of grace and no one is upset with you, they obviously did not understand you. That it is a mark of actually being understood, that there is resistance and conflict. And it's, as Dr. MacArthur has said, the doctrines of grace are the great pride crusher. They are the great pride crusher. And for me, before I came to accept them, it was just arrogance on my part. It's not because I knew too much of the Bible. It was because I knew too little of the Bible. And I just felt like I had done God some big favor by believing upon His Son and going into the ministry. And I had no idea of sovereign election and the humbling effect that it brings to the soul. So, I can tell you from personal experience what not to do. But I think that no matter when I would have brought it out, with an unsaved people, it will always be provocative. With carnal people, it will always be provocative. With immature people, it will always be provocative. And so you just have to know that going in. And just be ready.
Whether it be the 9/11 or that jump off second, or cultural disasters, political times, you could probably do this in 2 minutes, but maybe address when it is that you press the pause button, you address the culture because people are struggling.
Well, yeah, the question is, when do you address like a catastrophe or a tragedy or a cultural upheaval? I think when it's on everyone's mind and it's very abrupt and it's unforeseen and it's traumatizing emotionally, that you do pull over and stop and address it. You can't just continue to do it. I mean, the news cycle today on cable TV is, there's always something there. So you really have to pick your mountains well when you pull over and address something, or you'd be addressing something once a month. And so it would depend, have you addressed lately a similar type issue? But those are great teaching points to give people a Christian worldview. And in some ways, the sovereignty of God is we just keep coming back to that again and again. I don't do it that much. And I stick pretty much to going through books in the Bible, and only rarely do I stop. If a hurricane hits Mobile, I'll preach Psalm 29. If there's a national election and we're not pleased with the way that turns out, I will. I preached a sermon on the sovereign. What do we learn from this recent national election? It does reveal a sense of relevance, that you are in tune with the times and addressing that. But I think you have to be reserve that for more rare situations, and we definitely do not want to be sensational and just always preaching on sensational subjects, because we want people to grow. And those, by and large, more inform than develop people. So, anyone else? Yes, sir.
Like Thessalonians, but Thessalonians talks about speaking, helping the weak.
Yeah. 5:12, something like that.
People. How do you maybe make sure that you're addressing each of those people appropriately? And sometimes certain guys can tend to they want to hammer people, and the weak in the congregation end up being discouraged all the time. Just that whole thing.
Yeah, maybe just to even quickly address that. I feel like a weakness in my preaching is I do kind of hammer people a lot. And I need to learn to have an eye out for the hurting person, and to speak more tenderly and compassionately. And sometimes it's even the selecting of the right text for that, the right book in the Bible, and to try to have some kind of balance, which is why I preached the messages I did on 1 Corinthians 13, just to try to even speak on love, while my tendency is to be more high justice, low mercy, and and I need to be more, higher in mercy. And I think that that's a weakness in my preaching, and I can only say I'm aware of it, and I'm praying and striving to be more patient. There are several times I'll walk out the front door of the house and I'll turn around and say goodbye to my wife, and she will say, "Remember, with patience," quoting 2 Timothy 4:2. And because I need to remember that. And I need to remember how long it took me to embrace certain doctrines. And I didn't grow up overnight, and I didn't get it overnight, and it took time. And I need to give other people time to get it and not set down ultimatums. But there are people, it's been well said, you preach to broken hearts and you'll never lack for a congregation. There are broken hearts everywhere and discouraged people. And these are difficult times. And we're not living in Mayberry. And that's one of the values of preaching through the Psalms, quite frankly, is they help us preach messages that offer tender hope to people.